That's good too. Okay. Well, it's great to see people. It's great to see people. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I've lived most of my life in the ancestral unceded lands of the Coast Salish people. And for that, I'm very grateful. And I'm also grateful to be here with you all, both in person and for those of you on Zoom, to share my passion for modeling, coming to you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. Hoi Chua. Thank you. So, yeah, that was a lovely introduction, Anna. Thank you very much. The doodle, word doodle there basically summarizes, I passed my CV through the doodle and that's what I got. So it seems reasonably accurate. It hasn't been 30 years of very complex models. It's been an incremental process. We started very simple with the models. Okay, so in Zoom, how about that? Okay. Technologically able. Yeah, there's the very first habitat suitability model I saw was built in '96. And it's certainly come a long ways since then. I'm going to try and give you a picture of maybe the last, what's happened over the last 5 years. It was really interesting preparing for this talk because I got to review a bunch of literature and really see how things have changed since the last time I looked. So I'm going to focus a lot on mapping marine living resources, and I'll spend a little bit of time at the end if I have time to get into a bit of the social, ecological aspects of it. All right. So a few sort of modeling truths I'd like to share to set some context around this. First of all, models are ubiquitous and they're absolutely essential, both for us to get through our daily existence with some intrinsic models that we have for processing vision or processing space, cultural models, how to cross the street, how to perform, how to work in crowds, that sort of thing. We use those intrinsic models all the time. And then there's these things that I like to call explicit models that we build in science. These are kind of a formalized extension of this effort to understand our world. But understanding our world is a kind of a difficult thing. Understanding is a bit elusive. Having trouble with my mask. Understanding is elusive because we don't always have all the information that we have. We only have what we can observe. And so we end up making a lot of assumptions to help us understand what's going on, particularly in models. And, you know, assumptions are exactly that. They may or may not be true. And so our understanding changes as we learn more, as we collect more data, and as we replace our assumptions with either better assumptions or actual observations. As a result, because there's all that uncertainty around assumptions, policy is based more often than not on human values and risk perceptions than it is on actual pieces of evidence. You can reflect on how the whole climate debate has gone, you know, to get an sense of that. I mean, we knew, or people knew that fossil fuels were affecting climate in the 80s. Shell had lots of studies showing that. And yet here we are 40 years later, and maybe we're starting to see a little bit of action. So it's not evidence so much as people's values and risks that determine policy, which means that if we really want models to inform sustainability science, they really need to reflect human objectives and the values and the risks that the people who are interested in what's being modeled have. Okay, so that it's salient to people. truths. I'll fight you if you don't agree with with some of those. Topics. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about ecosystem models. I'll introduce sort of model complexity, the process of model design. Then I'll give you an overview of what I'm thinking of now as sort of classic habitat suitability models, and the assumptions and challenges that go along with those. And then I'll talk about some of the emerging methods that are addressing some of those challenges. Okay, and then we'll try and tie it back to whether our model forecasts, that is predictions into the future, can actually be reasonable with the technology or the tools or the understanding that we have.
Okay, I'm going to run. Bye.
Ecosystems, particularly social ecological systems, are pretty complex, right? So understanding them is really quite challenging. But we want to understand these because we are interested in how we benefit from the abundance and distribution of these natural resources. And that means we have to understand the whole process. We have to understand everything from the forcing functions, the climate, the oceanography, how that feeds up the food webs and then distributes among the animals that we care about or that we exploit. And then we have to consider the whole range of human benefits that arise from those things. So there's a lot to consider here. And that means that ecosystem models are hard, right? And it's also why simplifications of the social ecological system are necessary so that we can build understanding. It's that classic decompositional kind of science. So the idea is that we focus on the specific components that we're interested in or that we have data on. So modeling is first and foremost about asking hard questions about what is in and what is out so that we can reduce that complexity to something that's tractable. And this process of model design has a bunch of fairly well-defined steps, starting with the question, what are people interested in? What are you trying to answer? What sort of model do you need? How complex, or what does your model need to include? Then you have to find some data, decide on what method you're going to use, and then define the structure of the data and how it's going to fit into your methods. I mentioned assumptions already. Well, each of these steps has assumptions, and every one of those assumptions has uncertainties. Those uncertainties can be characterized in various ways, but they're not in modeling papers. And in models in general, we are very bad at reflecting on the uncertainties that the assumptions bring and how those uncertainties affect the inferences that we draw from the models. And we talked about that a little bit with Kai in this bioscience paper, where that was also included a literature review of how bad that actually is. So that's something I could talk about, but I'm just putting it out there right now as something to keep in mind, that there are uncertainties and that they're not usually well exposed in the papers that you're reading about modeling. On the contrary, when we publish our modeling papers, we want people to see how good the models are, not undermine our own stuff. So it's a bit of a problem with the whole academic exercise, but nevertheless, there are uncertainties in this process. And something I'd like to point out is that a bad assumption is probably way worse, or can be way worse, than bad data, because a bad assumption can totally move you into a space that's unrealistic and doesn't reflect reality at all. So it's worth considering the assumptions that you put into your modeling process. So finding some data, I mean, ideally, you want data collected for purpose. You want to design, you want to ask your question, design your study, and then go out and collect the data. But this is not a lab. This is not a little plot that we're talking about in some experimental forest. These are ecosystems. So any one project, any one person is unlikely to collect the data necessary to have a big enough data set to do any sort of ecosystem level study. So the reality is that we typically work with data that are available, at least partially. For habitat suitability modeling, and a lot of this data is picked up from catch records for commercial species, historic records, museum records. any sort of sightings of species that people can find have been used in habitat suitability models. These random or opportunistic data are much rarer for marine than they are for terrestrial species, which makes this whole exercise a little bit more challenging in the marine system than on the landscape. A lot of the methods that we use in the marine environment were originally developed on the landscape and have had to be adapted to the more dynamic environment. Now, before I get into the modeling with not very much data, I want to mention just a few contexts that have lots of data that are doing some really nice work. The first is something called EcoCast, which runs off the coast of California and up into Oregon a little bit. They call this a dynamic ocean management system. This has been developed over the better part of a decade, if not more, by Elliot Hazen and colleagues down at UC Santa Cruz. Elliot also works with NOAA Fisheries. This tool is actually really, dynamic ocean management means managing the ocean dynamically out to a few weeks, okay? This tool was built for fisheries to avoid endangered species as bycatch. And the fishery is very motivated to do this because the regulations are such that if you catch too many endangered species, your fisheries get shut down. So there's a lot of buy-in from the user group here. This tool sits in all the commercial vessels off of California and Oregon now. And what they've done is they've built habitat suitability models for 5 endangered species. I blew that up so you can read it. You read those species? Yeah, okay. So I won't read them out to you. But what EcoCast shows over here is where it's kind of safer to fish and where you're more likely to catch an endangered species, whichever one that happens to be. And this is the forecast for earlier this week. What more do I want to say about that? It's just a really good example of integrating a bunch of different data sets, a bunch of different species. And they also have a whole bunch of physical predictors down there. They've got good remote sensing. They've got a high resolution circulation model, which gives them their ocean currents. And they've got data sets that go back 50 years, on a lot of these species. This is actually where one of the first habitat suitability models that I mentioned was produced, because they're mandated as part of the Endangered Species Act to survey these species regularly. So the size of the data is huge here, which is why they can do what they can. Okay. The other data-rich context I want to mention is the Gulf of Alaska. Alaska is another jurisdiction that has excellent fisheries data, and they're also very interested in predicting the distribution of several commercial prey species. This is important for setting catch limits because these species interact. The species names are across the top there. I think it's arrowtooth, pollock, cod, and halibut. And this is how their relative distributions change from year to year. The thing is that if there's a good pollock cohort, I think that's how it works. I think the pollock eat the young arrowtooth. So if you have a good pollock season, you're going to have fewer arrowtooth, and they need to know this so that they can manage the catch allocations. Thorsten has been instrumental. He must be working on his PhD or recently finished his PhD, because he's put out a series of papers of increasingly complex joint dynamic species distribution models, which is one of the ways that we are now bringing together the interactions between species and being able to predict the more community distribution rather than a single species. Okay, joint dynamic models bring together latent variables, because there's a lot of complexity. So they actually use some ordination to generate latent variables to make things more computationally efficient. And the dynamic factor uses geostatistical methods. So there's actually a bunch of geospatial statistics underlying this. And the densities, the species densities, are a combination of the linear factors a linear combination of these different factors. And it's all hung together in a hierarchical Bayesian framework, which really chains together a set of dependent functions and parameters. So it's a whole lot of stuff going into building these models. Unfortunately or fortunately, nobody else has the data to do this. The Gulf of Mexico might have rich data like this, and there might be some places in Europe. The Mediterranean Sea might have similar data, but the Europeans are taking a different approach to coastal zone management. So things look a little different there. But not even DFO has the data to do this sort of work. So we're all left doing more pedestrian kind of things, which we'll talk about now. You could be so pedestrian that if you have no data, you can still build models. One of my favorite approaches are habitat suitability indexes, which were expressed more than 40 years ago by the US Fish and Wildlife Service when they realized they needed to manage species on rangelands. Computers were in their infancy. They needed to know, though, where they were going to allow people to ranch or log or whatever in the face of endangered species, because the Endangered Species Act was in '73. So they were mandated to do something. They had to figure it out. These indices are based on known or presumed ecological relationships between the species of interest and some environmental factor that you can measure. I'll show you an example a little bit further on. The other interesting application in a no data context is something called AquaMaps, which is now sort of a sister product to FishBase from the Fisheries Center here. AquaMaps, Kristen also did her PhD with Daniel, so that's the connection there. And she, for her PhD, she modeled using something that she called the Relative Environmental Suitability Index over 100 marine mammal species and their interaction with global fisheries. And her data was simply range maps produced by species experts, global range maps produced by species experts. And her index was based on depth, distance to ice, and distance to shore. And this is now a really popular biodiversity tool used to measure the overlap of fisheries and not just marine mammals anymore, but I think there's over 1,000 species in AquaMaps now. So there's a lot you can do even without a whole bunch of data, as long as you have a bit of understanding. The trick is that what is accurate at a global scale or informative at a global scale tends to break down as you drill into higher resolution, okay? Because it can be accurate on a global average, but very inaccurate at locations within that. So talk about that a little bit more as well later on, I think. Okay, so with that context and these two extremes, what most of us do is go through these 4 steps to build what we call habitat suitability index models or species distribution models. You collect some field data, you get some environmental layers, you identify the relationships between the two, and then you create maps predicting the suitable habitat. 2 really important things I want to tell you about this. Once you collect your observations and pair them with your environmental conditions, you have a table. You have a table of data. So all this business of identifying relationships is straight up statistics on a table of numbers. There's no spatial component to most of these models. They're based on those sorts of relationships. And the second thing is that the maps are entirely driven by the environmental layers, right? Because that's the only spatial information we have here. So when you get here, the fact that your species is clumped in different areas is entirely because of the spatial autocorrelation in the environmental layers. Okay, so I have a tendency to repeat things if I don't think I said them clearly enough, but maybe that was good. Okay, so we have this sense, I guess the reason I bring that up is because I have this sense that spatial models have to have some spatial analysis in them. And while it's true that there are people who are using spatial autocorrelation to build predictions, this standard method is by far the most common. And so that's, yeah, it's by far the most common. We'll just leave it there. Defining the relationships is then the fun part, or that's where all the methods come in. There we go. Okay, and there's lots of ways to do this. I didn't notice that bar was at the top. It's been there the whole time, hasn't it? Okay. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that. It says defining relationships under there. I can read those to you. This is sort of in terms of complexity, ordered in terms of complexity, or the age of the approaches. The envelope models are pretty much what they sound like. Then came regression approaches, because remember, we're working with a table of numbers. And I like those because they have functional forms, which kind of hint at process. Then as computers got more powerful, we started to do just straight up correlative approaches. This is what we're calling big data now. Some people even call it AI, but really it's just a bunch of correlation analysis. That includes random forest models, boosted regression trees, something called Maxent, which is really popular. And what these do is they provide a very good description of the data, because that's what they're looking for. And how much that description of the data is a function of the species or the biases in the data collection is kind of a matter of debate, because if you overfit to bad data, you're going to have a bad model. So that's why it really matters that your data are unbiased and independent, which they rarely are in these cases. So there's an issue with the correlative models that we'll also get to in a minute. And because all these approaches generate different results, some more different than others, we realized a few years ago that if you built an ensemble model, that is, build 5 of these using different methods, for example, and then combine them, then you can look where the most important thing that can tell you is edge cases, because the variance between those 5 models that you build, if the variance is high, it'll light up areas where all the models show some uncertainty, and there might be a problem in that area. Whereas in spatial locations where the models agree, you can be quite confident in the results. So there's a bunch of different statistics that you can pull out from ensemble models that you can't if you just use a single method. Common assumptions. These are shared across virtually all those methods to some degree. This is probably the biggest one. I also ordered these in terms of biggest, most important to less important. Processes are stationary in time and place. This means that a relationship, remember the relationship chart, the relationship that you define in English Bay here off the coast, off of Vancouver, you're assuming that that's the same relationship that occurs on the west coast of the island, or up in Haida Gwaii if you're building a model of BC. Also, you're assuming that that relationship is the same next year as it was this year. A very bad assumption, but it's a necessary assumption for a lot of this modeling work because we generalize things. All dominant processes are represented. This goes back to the model design. Did you leave something out that's really driving the thing? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Fit to data implies forecast skills. So this is about how models are evaluated. Remember, I mentioned correlative models are fit the data well because they look for correlations. When those are, talk less, go faster. There are metrics, most model metrics compare your predictions to a set of observations. And fitting those observations, unless you have future observations or a different set of observations in the context that you're interested in, you can't actually measure forecast skill. All you can measure is how well you're representing the data that you fed the model. Okay, so that's an assumption we're starting to understand isn't really the best. And there are ways of dealing with that. And abundance being proportional to suitability. Most of these methods produce a habitat suitability measure on a range of 0 to 1. So it's kind of like relative suitability between parts of the study area. And the question is that equivalent to the abundance there? Like, can you take your population estimate for your area of interest and sprinkle it across your study area according to those probabilities? And the answer is absolutely not. You can't. Abundance isn't proportional to suitability. So we have to make that, we have to start modeling that, that translation as well, that transition from suitability to abundance. And that's where we've made a lot of the progress, as I'll show you in a second. Observations are independent and unbiased. I mentioned that. They rarely are, but it's becoming less of an issue with some of the newer methods. It doesn't matter so much. And predictor variables are independent. Those last two assumptions were very important for regression methods. For interpreting regression methods, they're less important now for some of the newer approaches that we're taking. So we're not going to talk about those two assumptions anymore. And I'll just give you some examples really of these first four quite quickly. This is where I have to have a drink. It was the only XKCD comic that I could find on assumptions. I thought it was a good one. All right. So non-stationarity, it's very easy to see if you look for it that things are not stationary. This is some recent work that we did building a predictive model of substrate for the Canada's Pacific Shelf. And the important thing to see here is that the accuracy increases as you move away from shore. Okay, so it's the performance is not stationary. There's different things going on in those different, these are depth zones, different depth categories. Okay. In a temporal sense, this is some work by Dorman, who basically looked at the correlation between temperature and precipitation. And the graph basically speaks for itself. Not only are things not stationary over time at one location, they're not even synchronous across locations. So it's, I guess it's both spatial and temporal non-stationarity. Okay. Are all processes represented? It's hard to represent all processes in a raster context, which is how most of these models are done. They're done on a grid. Because processes scale across space and time, and species are usually influenced by many processes happening at many scales. So this is space-time axis, and these are the processes that affect species distributions in the marine environment. Important to notice that they're symmetrical, that they're synchronous. The bigger the what's that? The bigger the distance, the bigger the time scale. Okay, you can't predict in these areas here. That doesn't make sense. I'll show you a slide for that too. And the other thing that this figure shows nicely is the areas that are sampled by different platforms, right? So you've got the moorings, the ocean moorings here. This white line that's harder to see, that's ship surveys, and the white rectangle here is remote sensing. Each of those platforms gives you different data at a different resolution, all of which could potentially affect your species distribution. You have to figure out which ones are going to be the most important to you, or maybe you just pick up the ones that are available, which is perhaps more common. And if you have nostalgia for hand-drawn figures and Courier font, then you can look at Steele's original description of these patterns. Also out of Elliott's lab down in Santa Cruz is some nice work on the scaling of these predictors. So here's a remotely sensed image. The original one here. This is called scaling of predictors. Typically, you work in one resolution when you're building your model, because working across resolutions is difficult and time consuming. And so what you have to do is either you aggregate things spatially, or you aggregate things in time, and you can see how that basically degrades the signal. Okay, so this is what a species might actually be responding to. But if you average it out too much, you're going to miss these eddies and these frontal features, which are probably important to some species. Okay. So model complexity and forecast skill. Remember I mentioned correlative methods like to explain data, and the more complex your model is, the more data it can explain. As you throw more parameters in a model, it explains more data. So this is some work. The title says complexity and forecast skill. And this is some work we did with some kelp data on the west coast of Vancouver Island. What I'm showing you here are increasingly complex models. Okay, there's a series of regression models. I guess they're all regression models, increasingly complex, though we relaxed, allowed more complexity in the GAMs down here. And this is area under the curve. This is a common metric used to estimate model performance, or really how well models observations agree with the predictions, okay? And you can see a very nice increasing relationship here with the AUC as models get, as the models get more complex. One thing I should have told you, I'll tell you now, is that we use two different approaches to do the validation. Cross-validation is a common approach to taking your data set and dividing it into a training data set and a testing data set. Okay, you train your model with like 70% of the data and you withhold the 30% to tests, to generate statistics like this. So that's what cross-validation is, and there's different ways to do that. The other thing that you can do is you can collect independent data sets that had nothing to do with the data that were built in the model. In this case, this is built based on some kelp surveys that I did, and the independent data sets here are some classified remote sensing images. Okay, now you can see that, so what you can see is that the cross-validation results increase with complexity, but the independent data kind of bounce around, right? And with the complex models do horribly at the independent data after a certain point. And what happens is that they're kind of okay until they totally overfit the data that was used to build them, and then they can't predict other data sets that show the same thing. Now, this is all sort of interwoven with data bias, observational bias, and all that sort of stuff, but the pattern's pretty clear, and other people have shown this as well. The other thing I want to show you with this figure is that the models on the left were all built using using the Habitat Suitability Index. Oh, wait, it showed up there. There we go. Okay, so there was no data in these three models. It was built using the Habitat Suitability Index approach that I described. There's depth involved here. There's the three models are three different representations of substrate. I've been a little obsessed with substrate because bottom type is important in the ocean for a lot of species. So this has been a preoccupation for years. So anyway, three different substrate representations, but the same model. That's what those panels represent, the three different substrate models. So they do kind of crappy, right, compared to the data-driven models, at least over here. But when you look at the independent data sets, okay, they capture those not well, but better than the overfit models. So there is something to building models based on your ecological understanding, particularly if you want to transfer your model or predict data sets that you didn't use to build it. Okay, so there's this really tight coupling in data-driven models between the predictions and the observations. They're conditioned, the models are conditioned on the data. We started late, right? Okay. All I want to say here, we're going to speed up a little bit. All I want to say here is that these correlative processes, if left to their own devices, and people have fixed this, this used to be a real problem, but people have fixed this. Left to their own devices, though, they create these relationships that are hard to find ecological meaning in. I'd say those are pretty ecologically unrealistic relationships. You can control the classification so they come up with something more meaningful, but this is an example of that over conditioning on the data. We'll skip that. And because I want to really talk about suitability to abundance. No, I can't wrap up in 5 minutes. I will. A lot of the habitat modeling for the longest time focused on, this says from suitability to abundance up there. And a lot of the modeling has really focused on this abiotic component. Okay, how species are related to environmental factors. But species, of course, are affected by other things. They're affected by biological interactions with other species, and they're also also affected by movement or the inability to move barriers. And it's all those things that combine to give you this realized niche in the middle, as opposed to just this potential environmental niche. Okay, so the trick that a lot of people are working on, or the problem is to get at this by considering these two things instead of just the abiotic niche. And there's a lot of evidence that this is a problem. There was a recent review by Dallas and Hastings that looked at a whole bunch of models and found that, sure enough, abundance is not really related to suitability. Okay. All right. So getting at these challenges, addressing the challenges is the title of this slide. Non-stationarity in space and time. We need dynamic models to deal with that. You need the relationships to change over time and probably over space as well. Right now, we're getting forecasts from weeks to several years. So we could do short-term climate impacts, but the uncertainty gets pretty high beyond that sort of time frame, and they're very data intensive. Okay. Missing processes is kind of a fun one because it's a bit of a black hole. You could keep testing new processes over and until, yeah, you could just keep coming up with and testing new processes, particularly because of the scale question. You can use things at coarser, finer resolution, temporal scales, that sort of stuff. But there is a way to explore this with hypothesis testing. If you really wanted to see if a process that you can imagine makes a difference, then you can just explore that by putting it into a habitat suitability index or something like that and seeing if it improves the fit. There's a little bit more to say about suitability to abundance. This is where people have been thinking or coming up with tractable, I guess, solutions. There's biophysical niche modeling, which classifies the environment and then links it to biological traits like reproduction and energy produced, which you can then turn into population size. But it doesn't do anything about multiple species interactions. The joint species distribution models that I mentioned are probably the most popular way to be doing this right now. And there's something called stacked species distribution models, which are kind of my favorite, I think, just from a recent look at this, because they combine species distribution models with sort of these assembly rules. Okay. And it's very nice because the steps actually correspond to Soberon's definition of realized habitat here. The available species are defined by some dispersion filter, which you may or may not need. That's kind of the movement piece. And the habitat available is obvious. And the biological interaction, though, is done in this interesting way where you do a macroecological analysis to characterize the community using Shannon's diversity index or something like that. You can get a measure of how many species should be there. And then you come up with these ecologically sound, hopefully, or rules based on your ecological understanding to actually assemble the different components according to what you did before. So that seems like a nice, intuitive, structured way to do it. I think it's only been used a handful of times, maybe 2 times so far. So we'll see where that goes. But it's challenging, right? Because each of these steps is kind of a discipline in its own right. So it could be a lot of work to put these things together. As far as forecasting, I think the main challenge is still going to be assuming habitat associations and interactions are going to be the same now as they were later, or same later as they are now, better put. And I'm sorry I had to throw this one in because it's just so funny to think of half husband. Okay. What can we do in the current context? Well, I'd suggest that you don't use all your available data to build a model. Withhold some data sets that are collected in a different way at a different time, a different place from the ones used to build the model, so that you have independent data to actually do some of the model testing. Holding back data can help you identify non-stationarities, and data from different sources can, as I just said, let you do independent test data, and it can also be used for spatial assessment. Okay. And I really think we should do more leveraging our understanding, building models using understood processes, and reserving data, which are really valuable. Species observation data, particularly in the marine, are really valuable. You can hold those back for model testing. Okay. And I'll just show you my take-home messages. And want to say one thing about this. I think the physics of climate change is pretty much sorted. I think the climate models are reasonably reliable. Certainly at a global scale, the downscaling is getting better. Downscaling, I think, is at 4 or 10 kilometers, which isn't great, but in a marine context, it's not bad. But we still need well-tested, dynamic forecasts of community structure, not just individual species, but how those species interact and come together to form a community before coupling those habitat models to sort of decadal scale climate forecasts. My view is that we just don't really know enough about how those communities are assembled to start throwing unknown situations at them. And I'll leave it there, even though I have more to say, but I'll leave it there. Thanks. Always more to say. Yeah, sure. I don't know if there's anybody left on Zoom, but monitoring that. Any thoughts, you guys? Clarification questions would be good. Yes. Where the independent data shows that these models. I was surprised that this would not have been seen with the cross validation. This question of not being able to use better cross validation techniques to show the overfitting, or is it balanced? I see also why completely independent data shows better than. Yeah, no, okay, that's a great question. So the question for Zoom is, why didn't the overfitting of the data show up in the cross-validation test? Right, roughly. So there are some ways to do block cross-validation, where if you have a time series of data, now my God, if you have a time series of data, or if you have data that come from regions that you know are distinct, then you can do temporal and spatial blocking, which helps. It helps. I did temporal blocking. I did the remote sensing data were collected. No, sorry, my field data were collected over 3 seasons. So we blocked it that way. It didn't really help much. But some data you can block that way, and it does help. Tagging is another way that you can help. You can actually cross-validate based on your tagged individuals. You know, and so there's more independence between those data sets, and then that does help the process. But the thing is that every data set, even the ones that I just described, are often collected in the same way with the same protocols, and so they have the same biases, and So they're just not different enough from a totally independent data set, either in time or in space, or collected by different methods. That help? If you want, there's a good cross-blocking paper by Roberts et al. That I could share with you if you're interested in the cross-validation. There must be a modeling geek among you. More manual overfitting? Well,
yeah, sorry, that question's coming from me. I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry, I couldn't read it out. It's like manual in air quotes, as in if people are holding back part of their data, aren't they just going to go through and find where that, like, aren't they just going to run a bunch of models and see which one then just best fits that next set of data? Your
go ahead.
Manual overfitting is what I was sort of trying to get at.
Oh, are you suggesting that people would partition their data sets in some premeditated way?
No, just I guess just that you're just going to be fitting to those two data sets as opposed to just fitting to one. You're sort of running into the same problem of overfitting to your data set, but you're just running to.
I see.
But you're just going to be fitting to those two data sets instead of fitting. Like, it's like I don't know how like the general applicability question still comes up. I think even when you hold back like a test set, because if you're using it as your model validation, you know, you're not going to publish a paper that has an R squared of 0.1 on, or whatever is bad, you know, a 0.05 or something on your validation set. So you're going to keep running models. So that's what I mean by manual overfitting sort of thing.
Yeah, so I see what you mean. So if you brought together multiple data sets, well, there's, you can do that. That would be, the appropriate way to deal with that, I think, is with the cross blocking that, that we were talking about. And you, offhand, I haven't seen someone cross-block in that way. Perhaps because if you pull data sets together from different sources, there's a whole bunch of processing that needs to happen, right, to get them to standardize them. And maybe at that point, people lose the connection to the data source. But that's a really interesting question, though. It's worth exploring when you pull multiple data sets together to see if blocking on those would actually be better or not.
And do you think that sort of represents like variability or uncertainty, or is it like a model that's poorly fit? Like, is it just that there's different processes controlling different things in different places, and so you just have more uncertainty than you think you do? Like, are these well-calibrated models for a certain time and location, but they aren't generalizable? Or do you think that they're models that are not actually, or do you think they're models that are sort of just giving spurious results?
No, the more data that you throw at a model, I think the more different types of data, the more generalized I think it becomes.
Okay, yeah.
I don't have a study for that, but you're essentially averaging out biases, if you like, in some way, right? Or averaging out the different processes that are responsible for non-stationarity. So I think the more data, different types of data, the more generalizable it is. I forgot the first part of your question.
I was just thinking, you know, is this maybe a place for uncertainty analysis as opposed to trying to say that your models, that's sort of just like a comment, is that maybe this is a place where we should just acknowledge the uncertainty of our models and say there's bigger error bars than we like to acknowledge. But that's more of just a comment than a,
Yeah. Well, I think the difference is if you cross-blocked on different data sources, then I think what you might see mostly is a reflection of the different biases in the data collection.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, thanks.
That was fun.
We have two student questions on Zoom. The first one is from Steven, and he says, in my previous experience with species distribution models in mountain context, I found that breaking up the model by ecologically based elevation life zones vastly improved prediction over doing an entire watershed. Is there something similar that could be done in oceans? For example, depth zones or current zones? How do people determine the spatial bounds of the ocean model?
We would love to determine spatial bounds in the same way that you can do on the landscape. Yeah, that's fun. But no, that's a really good point, and I wish I had brought it up, because that's one of the ways of dealing with non-stationarity is to add a categorical variable that would capture exactly what he's describing, different elevation zones. Or we actually did it in the substrate model by including depth zones, right? So if you add that as a variable, then you give the data a chance to capture those non-stationarities, and the processes, the relationship between your species and temperature, for example, can be conditional on the zone that you defined. And it's very easy. Your model will tell you whether that categorical variable that you defined, that dummy variable, is useful or not. The data will tell you that. So that's a good way to get around the non-stationarity.
The questions are coming in. Okay, so we have another one from Dan. I've heard some critiques of ensemble models essentially boils down to more models aren't better models. Do you have any thoughts on this, Ed? What if your best model's results are then diluted by the addition of the worst model's methods? What if the best model's areas of uncertainty don't coincide with areas of uncertainty and make a worse model?
I think that's a fair comment. What you see in the modeling literature is a lot of frustration that we don't have a best model for a particular context, that we don't have the best performance metrics for evaluating models. We have a dozen modeling approaches, as many performance metrics, and we can't find a rubric for when each is best. And I think that the ensemble model approach may have been born of that frustration. People are looking at trying to get the best model that they have, and they have a bunch of different models. I guess it's one approach to maybe averaging out your uncertainty, averaging out your error. But I guess the thing to do, if you really wanted to know what was going on, would be to go back to the underlying assumptions of each of the models and figure out why it's wrong where it is, if other models are better there. And there might be a way to combine ensemble models spatially if you had that sort of information. So take the best, instead of adding them up over your whole domain, maybe there's a way to pick just the best models for the regions where they perform best. So it's more of a mosaic of models rather than an ensemble.
There's one last quick question here. Probably should wrap up with a minute left, but this is from Zach. He says, another question, what languages and tools do you think are best for producing these models?
Well, R is the obvious choice for most people now. Virtually every model that I referenced here was produced using some sort of R package, So that's a great place for anybody to start. And R has also done a lot of work in improving its spatial models or spatial modules, so that it's reasonably good at handling raster and vector data. So if you're just starting out your academic career or your analytic career and you're wondering what you should do with that, I think starting with R is going to be your best bet. It does interact really well with a open source GIS. Is it GRASS? I'm sure someone will correct me. It's either GRASS or the other one, Rowena. Rowena, are you still out there? Yeah, but there are still some things that R doesn't do well. And so if you have access to ArcGIS, it is a really great spatial tool. And if you don't mind programming in Python, then you can do a lot of your data prep and your visualization on the ArcGIS side. That's how I'm doing things now. I prep my data in ArcGIS using Python scripts. I throw that table that I described to you into R, do all the analysis there, and then I throw the results back into ArcGIS because it's just a better spatial tool. But if you can get by in R, that's what I would recommend.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I feel like a lot about modeling.
More than you wanted to, probably. Right. Thank you.